Welcome to Midnight Screen Files, the home of spine-tingling tales and mysterious adventures. If you love stories that twist your mind, explore the unknown, and leave you wondering what's real, you've found the right place. Each week, we dive into eerie tales of glitchy realities, strange encounters, and thrilling escapes. Let your imagination wander as you listen to stories that will leave you both intrigued and relaxed. So, get cozy, unwind, and let these stories guide you into a restful sleep. The Reflection. Lena had always admired the antique shop on Maple Street, with its shelves lined with forgotten trinkets and oddities that seemed to call out to her. It was on a particularly gloomy Saturday afternoon that she found herself wandering through its cluttered aisles. The place was nearly deserted, save for an elderly shopkeeper who barely looked up from his newspaper. As Lena perused the racks, her eyes were drawn to an ornate mirror tucked away in the corner, framed in dark, intricately carved wood. It was striking, beautiful even, but there was something about it that felt off. The mirror's glass shimmered faintly, as though it had a secret. Despite the unsettling aura, Lena couldn't resist. She knew she had to have it. The shopkeeper didn't seem to notice her interest at first. When she finally asked about it, he told her it was a recent acquisition and that the mirror had been in storage for years. He didn't offer much else, just a warning, albeit in a casual tone. The woman who owned it, well, she disappeared a long time ago. Probably best not to ask too many questions. That was all it took. Lena took the mirror home that day, excited to add it to her apartment. She had recently redecorated, and it was the perfect final touch for the living room. The moment it was placed on the wall, she felt a strange pull toward it. It was as if the mirror was waiting for her, just as she had been waiting for it. At first, everything seemed fine. But it didn't take long for Lena to notice the first oddity. One evening, after a long day at work, she stood in front of the mirror, combing her hair. Her reflection, as usual, mirrored every movement. Then, for a brief moment, the reflection hesitated, just a second longer than she did, as though it was waiting for her to finish. Lena blinked and shrugged it off, convinced it was her tired eyes playing tricks on her. But the incidents didn't stop there. The next morning, she noticed something different. A book on the coffee table in the reflection that wasn't there in real life. Lena's heart skipped a beat as she glanced around the room. The book was nowhere to be found, but there it was, sitting open in the mirror. She walked over to the table, half expecting to find it there. But it was empty. She stood frozen for a moment, staring at the mirror, then stepped back. Her reflection still gazed back at her, its quiet smile unsettling in the dim morning light. The unease grew with every passing day. She started to notice more strange occurrences, objects in the reflection that weren't in the room, movements that didn't align with her own. One evening, as she prepared dinner, she caught her reflection staring at her with a blank expression, unmoving, while she chopped vegetables. She froze. The reflection seemed to be watching her, waiting. Lena quickly turned away, but when she glanced back, it was gone. As the days passed, the mirror's hold over her grew stronger. Lena could no longer ignore the feeling that something was wrong. The reflection became more independent. It didn't simply mirror her movements anymore. It began to do things on its own, strangely exaggerated actions. One night, after a frustrating argument with a friend, she stood before the mirror, silently fuming. Her reflection didn't match her mood. While Lena was scowling, the reflection smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched across its face. Lena's heart pounded as she reached out to touch the glass, as if she could push the reflection back, force it to behave. But the moment her hand made contact, the glass felt cold. Colder than it had ever been before. And it wasn't just cold, it felt like it was sucking her in. She yanked her hand away in shock, but the feeling lingered, as if the mirror were pulling at her soul, trying to draw her inside. Unable to shake the dread, Lena started researching the mirror's history. She found that it had once belonged to a woman named Margaret Wiley, a woman who vanished without a trace years ago. There were whispers that Margaret had become obsessed with the mirror, spending hours staring into it until she disappeared. The rumors spoke of a curse, a malevolent force that trapped its victims in the glass. Lena was skeptical, of course. She didn't believe in curses. But there was something in the stories that gnawed at her, a growing sense of unease that couldn't be ignored. Still, she refused to part with the mirror. She couldn't bring herself to let it go. It was beautiful, and it was hers now. Maybe, she reasoned, it was just her imagination running wild. One night, after yet another unsettling encounter with the mirror, her reflection smiling back at her even as she turned away, Lena decided to confront it. She stood in front of the mirror, staring into her own eyes. "Show me the truth," she muttered under her breath. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, her reflection began to change. It started to warp, twisting in unnatural ways. Her face stretched, contorted into something grotesque. The eyes in the reflection became black holes, and the mouth split into a wide, grin-like shape. The reflection wasn't her anymore. It was something else entirely. Lena stumbled back, gasping, but her reflection didn't move with her. It remained fixed in the glass, its grin widening, its eyes locked on hers. And then, to her horror, it began to reach out from the mirror, its hand extending slowly toward her. Desperate, Lena turned to leave, but her reflection followed her. It was always there, lurking just behind her in the glass, watching her every move. It was as if the reflection had become a separate entity, alive, hungry, waiting. That night, Lena couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the reflection's twisted face in the dark. She felt like it was watching her, waiting for her to slip up, to lose control. When she finally woke, she found herself standing in front of the mirror, her hand pressed against the glass as though drawn by some unseen force. "Let me out," she whispered, but the reflection only smiled, wide and cold. In the days that followed, Lena became a shell of herself. She couldn't escape the mirror's grip. The reflection started to take over her life. It wasn't just the occasional shift in behavior anymore. It was as if the reflection had replaced her, staring at her through the glass, whispering things she couldn't hear. And when Lena was alone in her apartment, she felt the pressure mounting, the reflection watching, waiting. One evening, after an intense argument with her friend, Lena stood in front of the mirror, trying to hold herself together. The reflection smiled at her once again, and this time, it didn't stop. It reached out from the glass, its fingers brushing the surface of the mirror. As Lena stared into its eyes, the world around her began to shift. The reflection had won. When her friend came by the next day, Lena's apartment was eerily silent. The mirror remained on the wall, a reminder of what had happened. But Lena was gone, her fate sealed inside the glass, leaving only the reflection that grinned back at anyone who dared to look. Level escape. Jordan and Milo were ordinary enough, just two friends who gamed together after work. But this night was different. When they booted up the game Infinite Trials, the usual start screen flickered and warped. Instead of the standard menu, a single prompt glowed on the screen. "Begin reality." "Is this some kind of update?" Milo asked, leaning closer to the monitor. Jordan shrugged. "Never seen it before. Might as well try." With a click, the screen went black, and then the world around them did too. When Jordan awoke, he was standing in a field bathed in pale light. The grass felt too real under his feet, the wind too sharp against his skin. He spun around and spotted Milo a few feet away, rubbing his head. "Where the hell are we?" Milo muttered. Jordan gestured to the strange landscape. The sky was a swirling vortex of colors, and in the distance, a massive tower loomed, pulsating faintly. A voice echoed around them. "Welcome, players. Your trial begins now." Before they could respond, a glowing interface appeared in front of their eyes. It displayed a single objective: reach the tower. The journey to the tower was far from straightforward. The terrain shifted unpredictably. One moment they'd be crossing a serene meadow, the next they'd be scaling jagged cliffs with lava bubbling below. Time felt distorted. Minutes stretched into hours, and sometimes hours disappeared in a blink. They encountered other players, some desperate, others resigned. One man with hollow eyes warned them, "Don't trust the checkpoints. They're not what they seem." "What's that supposed to mean?" Jordan asked, but the man had already turned away, muttering to himself. Their first real challenge came at a forest's edge. Trees twisted unnaturally, their branches reaching out like claws. A glowing checkpoint hovered ahead, inviting but ominous. "Let's go around," Milo suggested. Jordan hesitated. "What if we're supposed to use it? And what if it's a trap?" The tension between them simmered as they debated, but the forest's oppressive presence left them no choice. They touched the checkpoint, and the world warped violently. The checkpoint threw them into a new level, a sprawling city where the buildings bent at impossible angles, and the streets were alive with shadowy figures that darted just out of sight. A timer appeared in their vision. 5 hours? For what? Milo asked. Jordan scanned the surroundings, maybe to find a way out. The city was a labyrinth of eerie silence and flickering neon signs. They found clues scattered about, a cryptic message scrawled on a wall, a faint melody leading them to an abandoned subway station. Each clue pushed them closer to the next challenge, but the shadowy figures grew bolder, their glowing eyes piercing the darkness. At one point, Milo froze. "Jordan, look." Ahead of them stood a figure identical to Jordan. It mimicked his movements perfectly, a grotesque parody. "What is this?" Jordan whispered, stepping closer. The doppelganger lunged, and chaos erupted. Milo fought it off with a rusted pipe, and the two barely escaped into a hidden alleyway. The clock ticked down relentlessly. As the final seconds approached, they stumbled into an abandoned warehouse. In the center, a glowing portal hummed, offering their escape. "That has to be it," Milo said, his voice shaking. "What if it's another trap?" Jordan asked. "We don't have a choice." With no time left, they leaped through the portal just as the timer hit 0. They landed in a vast open field beneath a sky of endless stars. For a moment, it felt serene, until the interface appeared again. Level 2, Survive the Void. "You've got to be kidding me," Milo groaned. But something was different. The air felt heavier, and the stars above flickered like dying embers. They spotted a structure in the distance, a faint glow emanating from its base. They had no instructions other than to survive. As they moved toward the glow, the ground beneath them began to shift. Shadows crawled out from nowhere, forming into monstrous shapes that pursued them relentlessly. The duo sprinted, adrenaline driving them forward. Milo tripped, and for a horrifying moment, it seemed the shadows would consume him. But Jordan pulled him to his feet, and they pressed on. At the glowing structure, they found another portal. This one was surrounded by symbols, pulsating in a strange rhythm. A console nearby demanded a code. "Do you remember anything from the clues earlier?" Jordan asked, frantically trying combinations. Milo closed his eyes, recalling the melody from the subway station. He hummed it, and Jordan matched the rhythm to the symbols. The portal activated, just as the shadows closed in. They emerged in a void-like space. It was featureless, yet suffocating. For a moment, it felt like the end. Then the voice returned. "Congratulations, players, you have completed level 1. "What does that mean?" Milo shouted into the void. "How many levels are there?" No answer came, but a faint light appeared ahead. It pulsed steadily, inviting them forward. "Do you think finishing the game will get us out of here?" Milo asked, his voice trembling. Jordan hesitated. "It has to." As they stepped toward the light, determination replaced their fear. They didn't know what lay ahead, but the faint glimmer of hope was enough to keep them going. The apartment. Megan knew she had found a steal. Or so she thought. The quaint apartment, nestled in an old Victorian building, came at a price that seemed too good to be true. "It's just a little dated," she said to herself, stepping into the space for the first time. The musty scent of aged wood and faint floral undertones of some long-forgotten potpourri greeted her. She didn't mind. It was hers. And the rent was affordable. The landlady, Mrs. Calloway, was an elderly woman with a soft, quivering voice and a gaze that lingered just a little too long. "You'll find it quiet here. Almost too quiet," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Megan laughed it off, signing the lease without hesitation. She needed a place to start over, and this apartment felt like a fresh page. The first night was uneventful, or so she convinced herself. The creaks of the old building played a symphony of unfamiliar sounds. Megan attributed the faint tapping on the walls to the heating pipes. "It's just settling," she whispered, pulling the covers tighter. Yet, her dreams were restless, filled with images of shadows moving across the walls and whispers she couldn't quite understand. In the morning, she found the windows fogged over from the inside. A single sentence was scrawled in the condensation: "You never leave." Her breath hitched. Megan shook her head, blaming a draft or perhaps her own overactive imagination. She wiped the message away with her sleeve and resolved to think no more of it. Days passed, and the apartment began to take on a life of its own. Objects weren't where she left them. A mug that had been on the counter was now in the sink. The keys she swore she placed on the hook were lying on the floor. Small things, but enough to unsettle her. Then came the footsteps. They weren't loud, just soft enough to be heard above the hum of her thoughts. At first, she thought it might be a neighbor, but they didn't follow any discernible pattern. Sometimes they would start and stop in the middle of the night, sometimes during the day when Megan knew she was alone. She mentioned it to Mrs. Calloway. "Ah, yes," the old woman said, stirring her tea. "The building has its quirks." "Quirks? You get used to them." The answer left Megan cold. One evening, after returning from a long day at work, Megan found an envelope slipped under her door. Inside was a photograph of her, sitting on her couch, looking directly at the camera. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She stormed upstairs to confront Mrs. Calloway, but the landlady simply chuckled. "There's no need for dramatics, dear. It's just a reminder." "A reminder of what?" "That you're where you're meant to be." Megan's anger gave way to fear. She bolted from the apartment and spent the night at a friend's place. But something drew her back the next morning, a compulsion she couldn't explain. The apartment seemed to punish her for leaving. The whispers grew louder and the shadows became bolder. At night, she would see shapes darting in the periphery of her vision, only to vanish when she turned to look. One night, she awoke to find Mrs. Billionaire Calloway standing at the foot of her bed. "You'll ruin everything," the old woman whispered before disappearing into the darkness. Megan had had enough. She packed her belongings and made for the door, only to find it wouldn't open. The locks refused to budge, and the windows were suddenly sealed shut. The whispers grew into a deafening chorus. They chanted, "Stay, stay, stay." Megan's jaw tightened as the whispers swelled around her. "Don't tell me what to do," she spat, defiance flaring in her chest. She grabbed a chair and hurled it at the window. The glass shattered, and Megan climbed out onto the fire escape, gasping for air. When she reached the ground, she looked back up at the apartment. It was dark, lifeless, as though no one had lived there for years. Yet, in the faint glow of a street lamp, she could see Mrs. Calloway watching her from the window, her expression unreadable. Megan didn't stop running until she was far enough away to feel safe. She vowed never to return. Months later, she had settled into a new apartment in a different city, the memories of her ordeal beginning to fade. But one night, she awoke to a familiar sound, the faint tapping on the walls. Her blood ran cold as she turned to see the fogged-over window in her bedroom. Written in the condensation was a chilling message: "You never leave." Panicked, Megan checked her surroundings. The layout of her room seemed wrong. Her furniture was there, but the walls looked older. The floorboards creaked in a way they hadn't before. Slowly, the realization sank in. The apartment had followed her. The dinner party. The gilded invitations arrived on the same day, to 5 very different individuals. None of them had ever met, yet each was addressed by name, printed in elegant gold letters. The cards bore a simple message: "You are cordially invited to an exclusive dinner at the estate of Marcus Velt. Attendance is mandatory." Below the text was the time, date, and address that none of them recognized. Curiosity and unease compelled them to accept. They arrived at dusk, one by one, at the sprawling mansion nestled deep in the woods. The estate was opulent but eerily isolated. As they stepped inside, they were greeted by an older man in a crisp black suit. "Welcome. I am Whitaker, Mr. Velt's butler. Please, this way." The dining room was grand, the table set with fine china and crystal glasses. Seated around it were the 5 invitees. 1, Clara, a freelance journalist, sharp-eyed and always searching for a story. 2, Dr. Elijah Grant, a renowned surgeon, stoic and measured. 3, Sophia, a young tech entrepreneur with a reputation for ruthlessness. 4, Darren, a washed-up actor whose best days were behind him. 5, Angela, a quiet but observant librarian. As they exchanged cautious pleasantries, Marcus felt entered. The billionaire was a striking man, his presence commanding yet strangely unsettling. "Welcome," he said with a faint smile. "I'm honored you all could join me tonight. You must have questions, and I assure you, all will be answered. But first, let us eat." The first course was served, a delicate soup that tasted far too exquisite to belong to this world. The conversation around the table was strained, everyone probing for information. "Why us?" Clara finally asked, breaking the tension. Marcus raised his glass. "To connections, my dear." Angela frowned. "Connections?" "Indeed. Though you may not realize it, each of you shares a thread that ties you to one another. And to me, tonight is about discovery." The second course arrived, roasted duck with an array of sides. As they ate, Marcus prompted them to share a bit about themselves. "Clara, you've written many fascinating exposés, haven't you? Particularly on corporate corruption." She narrowed her eyes. "I have." "And Sophia, your startup disrupted entire industries. Impressive, but ruthless." "It's business," Sophia replied curtly. "Dr. Grant," Marcus continued, "a pioneer in your field. Lives saved, but at what cost?" Elijah's jaw tightened. "I do what I must." Darren shifted uncomfortably. "Why are we here?" "Patience," Marcus said. "We're just beginning." By the third course, unease had turned into suspicion. Clara noticed how each of them avoided certain topics, how Marcus's questions seemed to cut to the core of their secrets. "This isn't a dinner," Sophia snapped. "This is an interrogation." "An interrogation implies guilt," Marcus replied. "I merely offer you the chance to understand yourselves." Angela's quiet voice cut through the tension. "Why tonight? What do you want from us?" Marcus leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "Redemption." Dessert was served, a decadent chocolate torte. But by then, none of them were interested in eating. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the room itself was watching them. "Enough of this," Darren said, standing. "I'm leaving." Whitaker appeared at the door. "I'm afraid that's not possible, sir." "What do you mean?" Darren demanded. Marcus sighed. "The doors are locked. You'll leave when the evening concludes." Panic rippled through the group. Sophia grabbed her phone, only to find no signal. Elijah tried the windows. They wouldn't budge. "What is this?" Clara asked, her voice shaking. "Some kind of sick game?" Marcus stood. "No game, a reckoning." He gestured and a screen descended from the ceiling. Footage began to play. Grainy, black and white scenes of each guest. Clara recognized herself sneaking into an office to steal documents for a story. Sophia's video showed her sabotaging a competitor's product launch. Darren's reel was of him berating a young assistant. Elijah's clip showed a patient under his care who didn't survive. Angela's video was different. It showed her in a library reading a book with a peculiar title, The Welt Legacy. "You knew," Marcus said, addressing Angela. "You've been searching for me." "You've been destroying lives," she shot back, her voice trembling. As the footage ended, the room fell into a heavy silence. Marcus looked at each of them, his expression unreadable. "I brought you here because you all share something in common, a failure to understand the consequences of your actions." "What consequences?" Darren demanded. "We've done nothing to you." "Not to me," Marcus said softly. "To the world. Your choices have ripple effects that extend far beyond what you see, and now it's time for you to experience them firsthand." The lights flickered, and the room shifted. The walls dissolved into darkness, and the table vanished. The 5 guests found themselves standing in a strange void, with Marcus standing before them. "What is this?" Clara demanded, her voice trembling. "How do you know so much about us?" Marcus smiled, but it wasn't a smile of reassurance. It was calculated, almost predatory. "Because I've been watching each of you for years." "Years?" Sophia's voice cut through the rising tension. "What do you mean?" "Every choice you've made," Marcus began, "has led you here. My algorithms flagged you as individuals of interest. Your actions ripple out into the world, destructive, self-serving, and careless. But you're not unique in that regard. What makes you different is that you're all connected to me. Connected how? Elijah asked, his composure slipping. Marcus stepped closer to the group. My family, my fortune, my legacy, each of you has played a role in its erosion. Clara, your exposé, filled with half-truths and assumptions, crippled one of my most significant ventures. Sophia, your cutthroat tactics, destroyed a company I built from the ground up. Darren, your scandals drained millions from my charity. Elijah, your negligence took someone I cared about. And Angela? Well, Angela was simply too curious for her own good. The air in the room grew heavy as the group absorbed his words. So this is revenge? Clara asked, defiance in her tone. Marcus chuckled, the sound cold and hollow. Revenge is a wasteful endeavor. No, this is education, and perhaps a warning. An experiment, Marcus said. A simulation designed to teach you the cost of your choices. Each of you will face the consequences of your actions. If you survive, you'll leave with a clearer understanding of the world you've shaped. And if we don't? Sophia asked. Marcus smiled faintly. Then you'll remain here. The void began to shift again, transforming into a series of fragmented scenes. Clara found herself in a newsroom, but the headlines were about her, the lives ruined by her stories. Elijah was in a hospital, surrounded by the families of those he couldn't save. Sophia was in a crumbling office, facing the fallout of her ruthless tactics. Darren was on a stage, being jeered at by the people he'd wronged. Angela was in the library, facing a version of herself who had made a different choice. The scenes were relentless, each a vivid reminder of their pasts. Time lost meaning. The guests struggled, each forced to confront the darkest parts of themselves. One by one, their protests and cries faded into silence, their images dissolving as they failed their trials. The void consumed them, their figures evaporating into the darkness until only Angela remained. She stood trembling, the library scene from her trial still etched in her mind. Marcus appeared before her, his expression unreadable. "Why am I still here?" she whispered. "Because you sought answers," Marcus replied, "and because you, unlike the others, can still change." Angela's breath hitched as the void around her began to shimmer. A doorway appeared, glowing faintly. "Go," Marcus said. "Carry their lessons with you." She hesitated, looking back into the empty void where the others had stood moments ago. Then, without another word, she stepped through the doorway. The cold air of the outside world hit her like a shock. Angela turned to look back at the mansion, but it was gone, replaced by an empty field under a starless sky. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus was still watching, and that the others were still somewhere in the darkness. A slip in time. Samantha and Eric had been planning their trip to Bulgaria for months. The quiet allure of the Rhodope Mountains, the whispers of ancient folklore, and the promise of serene isolation had drawn them away from their usual beach vacations. For Samantha, it was a chance to connect with her family's distant heritage. For Eric, it was a welcome escape from the grind of city life. Their journey began like any other. Long flights, cramped rental cars, and an Airbnb nestled in a quaint mountain village. The cottage was charming, with wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and windows that overlooked rolling hills. The elderly host, Ivan, greeted them warmly. "You've chosen a special time to visit," he said, his accent thick but his English precise. "The air is different here this season." Samantha smiled politely, brushing off the cryptic comment. "We're looking forward to exploring. Any places you recommend?" Ivan's face darkened slightly. "Stay on the marked trails, and if you hear the bells, turn back." Eric laughed nervously. "Bells? Like church bells?" Ivan shook his head. "You will know if you hear them." The couple spent their first few days hiking, photographing the stunning vistas, and indulging in local cuisine. The air was crisp, the kind that cleared your lungs and made the world feel sharper. But as they ventured deeper into the wilderness, they began to notice strange details. Footpaths that seemed to shift overnight, trees that looked oddly familiar, and a peculiar absence of wildlife. "It's probably just our city brains overthinking," Eric said, though he sounded unsure. On their fourth day, They decided to explore a trail that Ivan hadn't mentioned. Samantha had found it on an old map in the cottage. It led to a place marked simply as Pustina, the wasteland. It's probably just a dramatic name, Samantha reasoned. Eric hesitated. Ivan said to stick to the marked trails. Come on, she teased, tugging his arm. What's the worst that could happen? The path was overgrown and narrow, but manageable. As they walked, the forest grew denser, the canopy blotting out the sunlight. The air felt heavier, and a faint metallic tang lingered on their tongues. Then, faintly, they heard it. A single, haunting chime of a bell. Do you hear that? Eric asked, stopping in his tracks. Samantha nodded, her expression uneasy. It's probably just a goat herder or something. But as they pressed on, the bells grew louder. They weren't rhythmic like church bells. They were erratic, echoing as if bouncing off unseen walls. The forest seemed to close in around them, and the air grew colder. I think we should turn back, Eric said. Samantha was about to agree when they stepped into a clearing. Before them stood a crumbling stone archway, half swallowed by the forest. Strange symbols were etched into its surface, their meaning lost to time. This must be it, Samantha whispered. Pustina. Eric's unease deepened. I don't like this, Sam. Let's go. But Samantha was already stepping through the archway. The world beyond the archway felt wrong. The forest was eerily still, the air devoid of sound. Even their footsteps seemed muffled. The sky was a strange colorless gray, and the light didn't seem to come from any discernible source. This is amazing, Samantha said, pulling out her camera. But when she tried to take a photo, the camera wouldn't turn on. Eric's watch beeped erratically, the digital face flickering. Something's not right. We need to leave. Before Samantha could respond, the bells returned, louder and more chaotic than before. They seemed to be coming from every direction. Run, Eric said, grabbing her hand. They sprinted back toward the archway, but the path was gone. The forest shifted around them, trees bending and twisting as if alive. Panic set in as they realized they were lost. Hours passed, or so it seemed. The strange light never changed, and their phones showed no signal. They were exhausted, their legs trembling with every step. Then in the distance, they saw a figure. Hey, Eric called, waving frantically. The figure didn't respond. As they approached, they realized it was a man dressed in outdated clothing, his face obscured by a hood. He stood motionless, holding a lantern that emitted an unnatural bluish light. Excuse me, Samantha said cautiously. Can you help us? We're lost. The man raised his head slightly, revealing hollow eyes that glowed faintly. He tilted his head as if studying them, then slowly pointed in a direction. Thank you, Samantha said, though her voice wavered. Eric grabbed her arm. Sam, we're not following him. Do you have a better idea? She whispered. Reluctantly, they followed the figure. He moved slowly, the lantern casting strange shadows that seemed to dance independently of the light. The bells grew quieter as they walked, and the forest began to thin. Finally, they saw it, the stone archway just ahead. But as they approached, the figure stopped and turned to face them. His hollow eyes locked onto Samantha, and for a moment she felt an unbearable weight, as if the forest itself was pressing down on her. Leave, the man said, his voice a guttural whisper. Then he vanished, the lantern's light snuffing out like a candle. They stumbled through the archway, collapsing onto the familiar forest floor. The sunlight was blinding after the gray haze of the other place. Relief washed over them, but it was short-lived. As they made their way back to the cottage, they noticed subtle changes. The trees were taller, their shapes unfamiliar. The village looked older, as if decades had passed. When they reached the cottage, it was abandoned, overgrown with ivy. The Airbnb plaque was rusted, its lettering barely legible. What happened? Samantha whispered. Eric checked his phone. It flickered back to life, displaying the date. But it wasn't the day they had arrived. It wasn't even the same year. This can't be right, he said, his voice shaking. A creaking sound made them turn. Ivan was standing at the edge of the forest, but he was no longer the man they remembered. His face was deeply lined, his posture bent with age. His once clear eyes were clouded, though they still held a faint, sorrowful glow. 15 years, he said, his voice raspy and thick with emotion. You've been gone for 15 years. Samantha and Eric stared at him, the weight of his words crashing down on them. That's impossible, Eric whispered, clutching his phone as if the device could refute the truth. Ivan shook his head slowly. Time doesn't flow the same way beyond the bells. You should have turned back. You should have listened. Reality is a fragile thing, isn't it? A simple choice, a fleeting moment, a single step through the wrong door, and the familiar world becomes unrecognizable. Tonight, we've glimpsed what lies beyond the veil of the ordinary. Stories like these remind us that some mysteries are best left unsolved, and some paths best left untraveled. Thank you for joining us in the shadows, where the unknown is only a heartbeat away. Be sure to come back for the next episode and browse through more of The Midnight Screen Files.